Have you ever felt the echo of a promise made long ago? A promise whispered in a time of war, sealed not with a ring but with an oath of loyalty. In the quiet, bone-chilling cold of Cape Elizabeth, Maine, a magnificent dog named Rocky began a strange, silent vigil. Rain, snow, or the relentless wind off the Atlantic, he never moved. He was guarding something lost, waiting for someone who was never coming home. But this wasn't just his mission. A retired Marine nurse found herself drawn into the dog's sorrow, uncovering a secret kept for 80 years, a soldier's sacrifice and a woman's enduring love. Some bonds are too strong to be broken by death. It's a story about a second chance, not just for a lonely house, but for two souls, one human, one animal, who discover that the deepest path to healing is in the act of mutual rescue. Cape Elizabeth, Maine, in the heart of the unforgiving winter, was a land sculpted by granite and ice. The relentless wind, carrying the stinging salinity of the Atlantic, whipped across the narrow peninsula, coating everything from the old fishing shacks to the massive rough-hewn beams of the Portland Head Lighthouse in a brittle crystalline layer of frost. The town itself was a study in quiet resilience. Houses were tightly shuttered, chimneys puffed steady plumes of wood smoke into the gray sky, and the ocean's roar was the dominant, solemn soundtrack. This was a place where people knew the meaning of enduring hardship, where the beauty was harsh and earned, much like the life of the woman who had recently sought refuge within its coastal solitude. Marty Peterson had found a small, sturdy shingled cottage set back from the notorious shore road, close enough to Crescent Beach to hear the rhythmic pounding surf, yet far enough to feel completely isolated. At 70 years old, Marty was a woman of trim, compact strength. Her posture, even when she was simply standing at the window, held the subtle, straight-backed discipline of her decades spent as a master sergeant and nurse in the United States Marine Corps. Her short, sensible silver hair framed a face etched with the fine lines of deep experience, but her clear hazel eyes, usually sharp and capable, carried a veil of profound, unaddressed grief. She had come to Maine from San Diego to escape the suffocating warmth and endless sunshine that mocked the cold emptiness left by the recent loss of her husband, Robert. The severe, demanding beauty of the New England winter, the necessity of stacking firewood and clearing the relentless snow, offered a clean physical pain that was easier to manage than the ache in her heart. She sought a silence that wasn't merely the absence of noise, but a fullness that could finally quiet the turbulent echoes of the life she had shared. The cottage, though rustic and smelling pleasantly of pine and old sea salt, was a deliberate, methodical step in her quest for a second chance at peace. Her first few weeks were spent in the meticulous routine of unpacking, a military exercise in organization. It was during the late, pale afternoon of her fourth week, as she was nursing a mug of strong coffee and watching the deep, gray light drain from the sky, that she first witnessed the ritual. It was a bizarre, arresting sight that seemed to belong more to legend than to a quiet Maine roadside. Standing motionless, positioned precisely beside a splintered, tilted, antique mailbox on Shore Road, an old piece of history that clearly hadn't functioned in years, was a magnificent German shepherd. He was an enormous creature, built powerfully with a striking coat of rich sable black and deep, lustrous gold tan. He was a dog of truly noble bearing, his head held high, his ears erect and alert, making him look less like a stray and more like a creature forged from the wild heart of the German forest. Marty, with her lifetime of training, instantly recognized the demeanor of a sentinel. He was not moving, not barking, and not scavenging. He was on post. She later learned, through brief, clipped conversations at the town's small general store where she picked up flour and kerosene, that the townsfolk had simply taken to calling him Rocky, perhaps for the rugged, stoic way he bore the elements. Rocky's presence was focused entirely on a single property across the road, the infamous Miller Cottage. The cottage was a classic two-story gabled home, but it was a picture of advanced melancholy decay. Its exterior shingles were sun-bleached and salt-eaten. The roof sagged slightly beneath a blanket of snow, and the windows were dark, vacant squares like eyes that had forgotten how to weep. Everyone in Cape Elizabeth knew the story, or at least the sad, generalized rumor, of the cottage being left abandoned for decades, a monument to a promise broken by the war. Marty understood the silent language of the abandoned post, and the loyal guard instantly. The dog was holding a vigil. The sight stirred a profound, unwelcome curiosity in her. She had come here to let go of her own past and her own losses, not to adopt a historical mystery guarded by a four-legged soldier. Yet Rocky's unwavering commitment, standing like a marble statue through a biting sleet storm, never once seeking shelter, began to gnaw at her. His constancy was a mirror to the steadfast, lonely duty she herself had kept throughout her career. He was a fellow traveler, a lonely soul tethered to a purpose she couldn't yet comprehend. His intense dark eyes, which occasionally flicked to acknowledge her car passing or the light in her window, were not hostile. They were heavy with an ancient, unwavering weariness, the kind of fatigue that comes not from physical exertion, but from the immense burden of a silent promise. This was the first time since Robert's funeral that she felt a pull toward something outside of her own grief, a gentle demand to care. On the third day of continuous sleet, she made her move. She waited until the deepest, gloomiest hour of the afternoon, when the light was fading rapidly, the hour Rocky always appeared. Marty put on her thickest wool coat and a pair of heavy, insulated boots. In her hands, she carried a sturdy, wide ceramic bowl filled with warm, rich beef stew freshly made, and a second bowl of fresh water. She moved slowly, deliberately, her marine training guiding her to make her movements non-threatening. When she reached the edge of her property, about 20 yards from Rocky's post, by the old mailbox, she knelt. "This is for you, soldier," Marty murmured, her voice rough from disuse, the sound barely carrying over the wind. She placed both bowls gently on a flat, snow-cleared section of the roadside, as visible and accessible as possible. Then, the most difficult part, she had to show trust. Marty stood, gave the magnificent stoic animal a simple nod, a gesture of respect from one guardian to another, and turned her back. She walked slowly, intentionally, back towards the warmth and shelter of her cottage, never looking back until she reached her door. She waited, watching through the condensation of her kitchen window, a silent observer in the darkness. Rocky did not move for a long minute. He simply remained, his head up, his senses assessing the offering and the retreat. Finally, slowly, with the controlled gait of a practiced predator, he moved towards the bowls. He drank the water first, deeply, efficiently, and then turned to the stew, eating quickly until the bowl was immaculate. When he was done, he looked up, not towards the food, but directly towards Marty's window. It was not a human look of gratitude, but a clear, cold acknowledgement. An agreement had been made. Then he turned and returned to his post by the dilapidated mailbox, resuming his silent, lonely vigil over the Miller cottage. The distance between them remained, a respectful boundary, but the solitude Marty had desperately sought now felt different. It was shared, held in a new, silent covenant forged between two lonely souls on Shore Road. The cold, determined grip of the Maine winter showed no sign of releasing its hold on Cape Elizabeth. The days settled into a routine of pearl-gray skies and the constant, abrasive sound of the wind chafing the shingles of Marty's seaside cottage. Every surface outside was dusted with a fine, glittering layer of frozen salt spray, giving the entire coastline a hard, crystalline sheen. Yet, within this demanding environment, a subtle, almost imperceptible warmth began to generate. It was the warmth of a new, unspoken commitment. Marty's daily life now revolved around the solemn promise she had made to her silent neighbor. Every late afternoon, just as the beam of the Portland Head Lighthouse began its sweeping, cyclical search across the darkening ocean, Marty would execute her mission. She would prepare a bowl of meat scraps mixed with high-quality kibble and a fresh bowl of water, then carry them across the short stretch of roadside to the designated drop-off point, a respectful distance from the Miller cottage. She never lingered. She never tried to coax or engage. She simply presented the offering and retreated, honoring the boundary Rocky had established. Rocky himself remained the epitome of the dedicated sentinel. He was a creature of absolute habit. He materialized exactly as the sun began to dip below the horizon, a large, majestic silhouette against the deepening violet sky, and took his post beside the battered, tilted mailbox. He would wait patiently, his gaze fixed on the derelict cottage. Only when Marty was safely back inside and her kitchen light was on would he cautiously approach the food. He ate quickly, efficiently, and always. Before turning back to his vigil, he would direct a brief, acknowledging glance toward Marty's cottage. This was their silent vow, an exchange of duty and trust that required no words, only mutual respect. The food was accepted, the boundary was maintained, and the mission of the guard continued. For Marty, this daily ritual was grounding. It gave her quiet purpose, focusing her disciplined energy outward rather than letting it consume her with internal grief. She realized with a startling clarity that her search for silence had been interrupted by a new compelling sound, the echo of an unfulfilled fidelity she felt honor-bound to support. The intensity of her focus on Rocky and the Miller cottage began to demand a distraction. Marty knew from her years in the service that isolation could be corrosive. She needed to anchor herself within the living community, not just the cold history of the shore road. She drove her sturdy old Jeep into the village center one frigid Tuesday morning, having spotted a small, hand-painted sign taped to the door of the historic First Congregational Church, Veterans Quilting Circle, Tuesdays, 10 a.m. This was a mission she could understand. The church basement was a refuge of unexpected warmth and sound. The air hummed with the gentle, steady whir of sewing machines and was thick with the comforting sense of hot coffee, old fabric, and a hint of cinnamon. It was filled with about a dozen women, mostly her age or older, their faces radiating the kind of friendly, practical competence unique to New England women. She was immediately welcomed by Eleanor Ellie Hayes, a woman with a kind, permanently rosy face and a mass of vibrant white hair, who served as the group's gentle ringleader. Ellie introduced Marty to the group, explaining the purpose of their work, creating beautiful, durable quilts for veterans in local hospitals and nursing homes, a small, tangible comfort designed to show appreciation. Marty found herself sitting beside Agnes Dubois, a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and hands that moved with astonishing speed over the fabric. Agnes, a character in the finest New England tradition, was initially reserved, studying Marty with a careful, assessing gaze that Marty, the former master sergeant, instinctively respected. As the needles flew and the pieces of colorful fabric began to knit together, the conversation flowed, weaving tales of family, weather, and, inevitably, the persistent local gossip. Marty, feeling a tentative comfort she hadn't anticipated, casually asked about the old place down the road. "That Miller cottage," she began, holding up a square of navy blue cotton. "Looks like it's been empty forever." Agnes paused her meticulous stitching, lifting her glasses slightly to look at Marty. "Oh, the Miller place," she said, her voice dropping slightly, laced with the subtle, familiar melancholy of shared history. "It's a sad one, dear. Goes back to the war, the big one, World War II." Ellie and a few others nodded somberly. Agnes took up the narrative, speaking with the authority of someone who had lived through the era's echoes. "Henry Miller, we called him Hank," she explained. "He was a local boy, married to Helen, just a sweet, quiet girl. Hank was in the 101st Airborne, the Screaming Eagles. An absolute hero, they said. Got himself a Silver Star, came home on leave once, and was the pride of the county." Agnes sighed, a deep, resonant sound. "He didn't make it back after D-Day. Reported missing in action first, then presumed dead a few years later. The government sent the flag and the medals, but Helen—" Agnes trailed off, shaking her head. Helen just couldn't accept it. She was convinced that the report was wrong, that he would walk up that shore road any day. She lived there, in that cottage, alone. Never changed a thing, never married again, never left town. "She maintained the house perfectly," Ellie added softly, folding a length of material. "Right up until she passed, nearly 30 years ago now. Folks say she kept the porch light on every night, right until the day she died, as if his plane would land right on Crescent Beach, and he'd need to see the light." Marty listened, her hands momentarily stilling over the fabric. The image of the derelict cottage was suddenly replaced by the image of Helen, a steadfast woman, a soldier's wife, maintaining her post, holding firm to a promise the world insisted had been broken. It was a loyalty she recognized, the commitment that transcends logic and becomes a part of the soul. The way Helen had lived in utter solitude, maintaining a sanctuary for a love that could no longer return, was the same way she had been living since Robert's death. It hit Marty with a gentle but firm force. She had moved to a quiet town to escape a ghost, only to find a community still guarding one, and she was now the active accomplice of its four-legged sentinel. She took a deep breath, the cinnamon and coffee smell suddenly comforting. "There's a German shepherd," Marty said quietly, drawing the attention of the entire circle. "He sits by the old mailbox every afternoon, just staring at the cottage." Agnes's eyes narrowed slightly in deep thought. "Rocky," she murmured. "Yes, he's been around. Never does any harm, but never lets you near either. Always on watch." She looked pointedly at Marty. "Isn't that strange, dear? It's almost like—" She paused, then shook her head, dismissing the thought as old wives' tales. Marty didn't press the point, but the silence once again was full of meaning. She now understood the context of Rocky's vigil. It was the continuation of Helen's own silent, decades-long vow. Marty's new routine, the food, the water, the respectful distance, was not just charity. It was her own quiet participation in a story of unwavering fidelity, a mission to honor the enduring love of Helen and her heroic husband, Sergeant Henry Hank Miller, the soldier who never came home to the cottage. The subtle warmth that had begun to grow within Marty was the recognition of a shared burden and a sense of duty she welcomed completely. The weather in Cape Elizabeth transitioned from biting, sustained cold to a tempestuous chaos that only the North Atlantic coastline can deliver. The air grew thick and heavy, smelling strongly of ozone and impending fury, a distinct shift that signaled the arrival of a major nor'easter. The massive, towering pines and firs along Shore Road groaned under the lashing wind, their needles rattling a desperate symphony against the glass of Marty's cottage. Inside, Marty watched the sudden, violent turn of the storm with the practiced calm of someone who had seen nature's worst tantrums in far less hospitable places. Yet, the gathering storm did not fill her with dread. Instead, it solidified the quiet mission that had taken root in her soul. Rocky's unwavering loyalty to the Miller cottage had stopped being a curiosity and had become a sacred trust she felt compelled to honor. Marty had served alongside men and women who held impossible posts, keeping impossible promises, and she knew the posture of commitment when she saw it. Now, she needed to understand why this magnificent creature was the final link in Helen Miller's chain of fidelity. She decided to approach the puzzle methodically, starting with the human connection. At the next Tuesday meeting of the Veterans Quilting Circle, the storm outside was barely a whisper compared to the comforting roar of the sewing machines. Marty felt a sense of belonging in the church basement now. The women's quiet competence was a balm to her structured marine sensibilities. She sat down, unwrapping the spool of red thread for her current quilt square. "Agnes," Marty began, keeping her voice low as not to disrupt the rhythm of stitching. "You told me about Helen and Hank Miller. It's the dog, Rocky. He's always at that mailbox watching the house. It's too specific to be random, you know? It feels like he's waiting for something specific to appear from that road." Agnes Dubois, never one to rush a statement, nodded slowly, her fingers deftly weaving a complex pattern. "That dog, Rocky, he's got old eyes, hasn't he? Sees things we don't." Agnes paused, then added a detail that cut through Marty's logical defense. "You know, Hank was crazy about dogs, couldn't stand to be away from them. He had a dog when he was a boy, a German Shepherd puppy, right before he shipped out. His wife, Helen, kept that dog for him as long as she could." Agnes stopped stitching, and her gaze drifted towards a sunbeam, hitting the dusty church window, a look of deep, ancient nostalgia clouding her features. "That dog's name, I haven't thought of it in 60 years. They called him Patch. Yes, Patch. Because of a small, dark marking on his ear, Hank doted on that dog. Said Patch would be his wingman when he came home." The word hit Marty with the force of an unexpected command. Patch, the name of the dog Hank left behind. Could Rocky be related? Was it some unbelievable coincidence? Marty felt the invisible threads of the past tightening, pulling her closer to the heart of the mystery. Rocky wasn't just guarding the Miller cottage. He was potentially standing on the exact spot where a Patch once waited for his soldier to return. The information solidified her resolve. The answers wouldn't be found in modern genealogy databases. They were buried right there on Shore Road. That evening, the nor'easter struck with full, malevolent intent. The wind was a solid physical force that rattled the very foundation of Marty's cottage, and the snow fell in blinding horizontal sheets. Marty watched through her large picture window, fearing that the ferocity of the storm would finally force Rocky to abandon his post. But as her flashlight beam cut a weak, wavering path across the road, she saw him. He was huddled close to the derelict mailbox, his thick sable coat plastered to his powerful body, coated in a crust of ice, but still he remained. He was a creature of immense will, holding his position against the absolute fury of the Maine coast. Marty's marine training kicked in. A good soldier never leaves a comrade exposed. The cold knot of duty mixed with compassion in her gut was unbearable. She pulled on her heaviest waterproof gear, the kind that had seen service in typhoon seasons, zipped her jacket to her chin, and secured a headlamp. She stepped out into the tempest. The walk across the short distance felt like a desperate battle. The wind stole her breath, and the snow stung her eyes like sand. Her focus was only on the massive dark shape by the mailbox. As she neared, she saw Rocky's head snap up. His eyes, dark and glistening with ice, held a brief flash of surprise, quickly replaced by a weary acknowledgement of her presence. He did not move to greet her, but neither did he move to block her. He simply watched, the sentinel observing the approach of a known ally. Marty knelt down in the driving snow beside the ruined mailbox. The wooden post was snapped halfway down, and the mailbox itself was permanently tilted at a mournful angle, half submerged in a drift of wind-packed snow. She realized that Rocky rarely sat exactly next to the pole, but slightly behind it, where the broken post met the ground. Marty began scraping the snow away with her gloved hands, following the precise area where Rocky always sat. The ground here was uneven, unlike the hard-packed gravel of the roadside. She cleared away a thick layer of ice and snow, then dug deeper, finding only damp earth and stubborn frozen weeds. She was about to give up, believing the spot was simply a sheltered pocket, when the toe of her boot scraped against something hard and unnaturally smooth beneath the tangle of winter-killed roots. She knelt lower, using the beam of her headlamp. It was a piece of stone, clearly cut and placed, and surrounding it were the brittle, twisted roots of an old shrub. With renewed focus, she cleared the area aggressively, pulling up the frozen weeds and snapping the smaller roots. Her fingers brushed against the thick, frozen edge of wood. Working with the quiet determination of a field engineer, Marty realized she had found a hidden structure. It was an old wooden plank, heavy and secured with rusted hinges, lying perfectly flush with the ground beneath the post. It was a clever, simple piece of concealment, meant to be ignored or mistaken for part of the post's support. It was an access point. She cleared the last of the debris, her heart pounding a heavy rhythm against her ribs that rivaled the roar of the storm. She looked at Rocky, who had moved slightly closer, his breath coming in visible white plumes, his eyes fixed intently on the patch of ground she had uncovered. He gave a soft, low whine, a sound of profound urgency and expectation. This was it. Rocky wasn't waiting for Hank to return on Shore Road. He was waiting for someone to find what Hank or Helen had deliberately hidden right here at his post. He was the guard, but the mailbox, the symbol of connection and communication, was the key. Using a stout piece of rebar she had carried from her Jeep, Marty wedged it under the edge of the plank. With a grunt of effort fighting the weight of the frozen wood and the decades of decay, she slowly prized it open. The plank resisted, squealing a long metallic protest against the storm, until it finally lifted, revealing a dark, square hole beneath the frost-hardened soil. The entrance to a small, forgotten root cellar. The air that drifted up was thick, cold, and smelled sharply of damp earth and something indefinable, a scent of profound stillness and undisturbed past. Marty looked from the dark hole to Rocky. She knew with the certainty of a Marine receiving vital coordinates that she had been granted access to the heart of the mystery. The gate had been found, and the Sentinel was now waiting for her to lead the way down. The nor'easter still raged across Cape Elizabeth, turning Shore Road into a blurred landscape of white and gray, but the furious noise of the wind and the pounding surf seemed muted to Marty now. Her focus was entirely on the dark, rectangular opening revealed beneath the ruined mailbox post. That small, square hole, smelling of frozen earth and the deep, undisturbed past, was a portal. The military discipline that had guided Marty for decades took over completely, suppressing the urge to question the sheer impossibility of the moment. She retrieved a powerful battery lantern from her Jeep, replacing her headlamp, and affixed it securely to a small hook inside the plank opening. The light, sharp and focused, cut through the darkness, revealing a short, sturdy wooden ladder leading down. Rocky, the sentinel, stood silently beside the opening, his gaze fixed on Marty, his posture radiating expectation. There was no hesitation in his eyes, only the clear, ancient command of a guide waiting for the traveler to proceed. "All right, soldier," Marty murmured, pulling her gloves tight. "You found the access point. Now let's see what you've been guarding." She descended the ladder slowly, testing each rung. The air below was shockingly cold, but strangely dry, lacking the expected musty odor of a Maine root cellar. When her feet met the solid, packed earth floor, she swept the lantern beam around. This was clearly not a typical root cellar meant for storing potatoes and jars of preserves. The small 5 by 8 foot space had been carefully lined with rough-hewn cedar planks, preventing the earth from collapsing. In one corner there was a makeshift wooden bench and a small, sturdy shelf built into the wall, suggesting it had been used not for storage, but for quiet work or perhaps solitary refuge. The dry cedar and the high, tight placement against the stone foundation of the road had protected this space from the perpetual dampness of the coast. It was a secret sanctuary, a world sealed away from the decay that had consumed the cottage above. Marty's heart hammered a rhythm against the fierce wind still audible through the wooden planks above. On the small wooden shelf, completely exposed to the lantern's beam, sat a single object that immediately anchored the space in its historical context, a drab olive-green metal container. It was an antique military supply tin, the kind used to carry rations or medical tools, its hinged lid sealed tightly. The tin was dull but free of rust, suggesting it had been placed here after the cedar lining had been installed. Marty knew instantly that this tin was the destination. This was the relic Rocky had been guarding. She climbed back up the ladder and with some effort, gently lowered the large German shepherd into the space. Rocky landed with a soft, powerful thud and immediately went to the far corner of the space, sniffing the bench intently. Marty rejoined him and knelt before the small metal tin. Its latch was stiff with age and cold, but with a sharp click, she managed to flip it open. The sight within made her pause, catching the air in her throat. The contents were preserved perfectly, protected by the tin's excellent seal and the cellar's dry cold. Everything was neatly organized, suggesting the hand of someone meticulous, perhaps a soldier or a devoted woman, echoing her soldier's tidiness. The first item on top was a thick, folded sheaf of paper tied with a piece of brittle, faded white kitchen twine. They were letters, yellowed and thin, and beneath them a collection of official-looking documents. Marty carefully lifted the papers, revealing the treasures beneath. First, nestled safely within a small, aged velvet pouch, was a military decoration. Marty's breath hitched as she gently pulled it out. It was a tarnished silver star suspended from a frayed ribbon of alternating white and blue. The silver star. It was the medal Agnes had mentioned, the one awarded to Sergeant Henry Hank Miller for valor. The medal, cold and heavy in Marty's palm, was the literal weight of Hank's sacrifice. It was wrapped in a piece of faded sateen fabric, the only piece of true domestic softness in the military tin. A piece Marty immediately recognized as having been torn from an antique wedding dress or a fine slip. Next to the medal was a small, perfectly sized leather dog collar. It was old, stiff, and cracked, caked in a thin layer of dusty dryness, but the metal tag riveted to it was still intact. Marty wiped it gently with the corner of her sleeve, angling the lantern light until the engraved letters shone clearly. PATCH, the name uttered only hours before in the quiet hum of the quilting circle, was now a tangible physical presence. This was the collar of the dog Hank Miller left behind, the first sentinel of the Miller cottage. The discovery was a profound, aching validation of Agnes's memory and Rocky's vigil. Marty's eyes swam with unshed tears, but she held them back, determined to complete the inventory. She then returned to the documents. The letter sheaf was Hank's last correspondence, its envelope unsealed and unsent. Written on military-issue paper, it was a heartfelt, desperate message to Helen, full of promises and the grim weariness of the war. But the most revealing items were the official papers, dated 1955, years after Hank was declared KA. They were legal documents from the local bank establishing a precise trust fund. The sole purpose of the fund, written in precise, heartbreaking legal language, was to pay the annual property taxes on the Miller cottage in perpetuity. Marty, a veteran herself, understood the meticulous planning required. Helen hadn't just waited, she had executed a long-term strategic defense to ensure Hank's home, the sanctuary he dreamed of, would be there forever. The love was not passive sorrow. It was an active, enduring force, a silent battle waged against the erosion of time and the bureaucratic reality of property ownership. As Marty knelt, surrounded by the powerful, tangible relics of a life interrupted, the magic of the moment reached its emotional crescendo. Rocky, who had been quietly exploring the small space, suddenly returned to Marty's side. He pushed his large head gently against the open tin, his deep, dark eyes fixing immediately on the small leather collar. He let out a soft, barely audible whine, a sound of profound recognition and deep melancholy. Then he used his wet nose to gently nudge the collar, a quiet act of respect and acknowledgement. This small physical gesture confirmed everything. Rocky was not just an ordinary stray. He was the custodian of a sacred vow, the living echo of the long-gone patch. He hadn't been drawn here by chance. He had been guided by an instinctual, almost spiritual loyalty, perhaps a form of genetic memory, leading him to the final resting place of his predecessor's post. Marty carefully placed the silver star and the letters back into the tin, but held the small, cracked leather collar of Patch close to her heart. She looked at Rocky, this massive, stoic dog, who had borne the storm and the crushing weight of history, and understood her new post perfectly. She was no longer seeking silence. She was now the keeper of the relic, the designated human to bring this frozen piece of history back into the warm light. The mission of mutual rescue was officially underway. The nor'easter eventually blew itself out, leaving behind a Cape Elizabeth that was starkly beautiful, scrubbed clean by the abrasive wind and sunlight. The air, though still freezing, possessed a crystalline clarity that highlighted the determined beams of the Portland Head Lighthouse. Inside her cottage, Marty was no longer a woman searching for silence. She was a woman on a defined, pressing mission. The military supply tin with its sacred contents, Hank's silver star, Helen's tax trust, and the tiny leather collar of Patch sat open on her kitchen table, illuminating the path forward. Marty had the relics, but she needed a living heart to receive the story. Her training as a master sergeant kicked in. The objective was to locate the next of kin. She began with the legal papers. The trust fund documents signed by Helen Miller in 1955 included the name of the law firm in Portland. Marty, using her old Marine network contacts, managed to trace the firm's successor and, through careful inquiry, obtained the name of Helen's closest surviving relative at the time of her passing, a niece who had since had a daughter. Combining this legal lineage with the vague family history gleaned from the veterans' quilting circle, Specifically, a crucial clue from Agnes about Helen having a brother who moved south. Marty painstakingly traced the line through death certificates and digital records. The process was tedious, demanding the same methodical focus required for a long-range reconnaissance. Finally, she had a name, a profession, and a location: Grace. Grace was identified as the granddaughter of Helen's late brother, the sole surviving heir, a licensed landscape architect, working and residing in Boston, Massachusetts. Marty stared at the phone number on her computer screen. Explaining this mission, the storm, the dog, the root cellar, the 80-year-old love story, to a skeptical modern young woman was arguably more challenging than navigating any combat zone. But the image of Rocky sitting steadfastly at his post compelled her. Marty took a deep, steadying breath and made the call. Grace's voice on the line was efficient, slightly clipped, and immediately suspicious. Marty, cutting through the professional reserve, delivered her message with the disciplined gravity of a formal notification. This is about a house in Cape Elizabeth and a promise made during the war to a soldier named Hank Miller. I have something that belongs to your family. It is a story you need to hear. After a tense, quiet 24 hours of uncertainty, Marty received a brief, non-committal text. I'll drive up Friday afternoon. Grace arrived on Friday in a pristine, dark-colored SUV, looking profoundly out of place among the battered pickup trucks of Shore Road. She was a woman in her early 30s, dressed in tailored city layers, her posture communicating a definite sense of obligation and profound skepticism. Her hair was pulled back into a neat braid, framing a face that was intelligent and attractive, but already carrying the faint lines of professional stress and creative dissatisfaction. She was clearly ready to dismiss Marty as a well-meaning but eccentric elderly woman. Marty met her on the porch, offering no apologies or explanations, merely a respectful, direct nod. Marty started the narrative not with the relics, but with the setting, recognizing that a shared history had to be felt before it could be believed. Tuyen Poo. She drove Grace straight to the Portland Head Lighthouse. The lighthouse, towering white and resolute against the ceaseless blue churn of the Atlantic, was majestic. Marty spoke softly, her voice carrying the memory of the decades. Your great-aunt Helen and Hank used to come here. This was their spot. They stood right here. Marty gestured toward the crashing waves and made their plans for the future. Hank would have seen this light as his guide home, his beacon across the sea. Grace remained silent, her skepticism slowly being eroded by the sheer, timeless power of the place. Marty spoke of the enduring quality of Helen's love, a commitment as steadfast as the granite foundation beneath their feet, a love that defined the concept of unwavering loyalty. Back at Marty's cottage, the real evidence awaited. Marty led Grace to the kitchen table, where the items were carefully arranged. The yellowed letters, the tarnished silver star, the legal document establishing the perpetual tax trust, and the small, cracked leather collar of Patch. The tangible weight of the history was undeniable. Grace, the professional architect whose world was built on clear lines and logic, watched her composure crumble. She picked up the silver star, the metal cold and heavy, and her eyes, bright green and intelligent, filled with tears. She understood the sacrifice now and the decades of quiet devotion it inspired. I never knew, she whispered, her fingers tracing the faded cursive of Helen's signature on the trust document. My grandfather never spoke of this. The moment was interrupted by the sudden, low whine of the Sentinel. Rocky, who had been quietly resting by the wood stove, sensing the profound shift in atmosphere, rose and moved toward Grace. He did not jump or bark. Instead, he approached her with the quiet dignity of a familiar friend. Grace, startled, instinctively knelt down. Rocky gently nudged his massive head under her chin, letting out a soft, deep, unmistakable sound of recognition. Grace gasped, her hand flying to the dog's thick, sable gold fur. She pulled him close, burying her face in his coat, tears finally streaming down her cheeks. The professional layers were gone, leaving only raw, honest emotion. "Bruiser," she choked out, the name vibrating with a desperate relief. "Oh my God, Bruiser, you crazy dog! Where have you been?" She looked up at Marty, her eyes wide with overwhelming realization and confusion. "This is my dog. His name is Bruiser. He ran away from my apartment complex in Boston months ago. We searched everywhere. How is he here?" Marty, the veteran who thought she had seen everything, felt the final unbelievable piece of the puzzle click into place. Rocky was not just like Patch. He was a magnificent modern German shepherd with his own name and his own human. "He came here," Marty said in awe, kneeling beside them. "He found his way to this exact spot on Shore Road, miles from Boston, to this abandoned cottage, to the mailbox where a dog named Patch once waited." Marty realized it wasn't some unknowable ancestral magic, but the power of a deep, instinctual memory, perhaps the lingering scent of old Patch, or an unconscious recollection of a long-ago visit, as vague as a childhood dream, that had pulled Bruiser Rocky to the home of his ancestors' deepest loyalty. The dog had not just been guarding a mission, he had been seeking the echo of his own human past, the home of his breed's original vow. The Sentinel's mission was now complete. The heir had returned, and the dog had found his way back to the only home his loyalty knew. The morning after, the incredible revelation dawned with a clear, stunning intensity unique to the New England coast. The air was frigid, sharp enough to take one's breath away, but the skies over Cape Elizabeth were a breathtaking expanse of pale sapphire, and the sun rose over the Atlantic like a promise kept, casting long, gold-tinted shadows across Shore Road. The world felt newly washed, renewed, and full of possibility. Inside Marty's small, warm cottage, the atmosphere was one of profound, exhausted relief. Grace, the architect, was sitting on the floor, her arms wrapped tightly around Bruiser, who was now happily responding to both his city name and his coastal moniker, Rocky. The dog, the magnificent German shepherd, who had borne the weight of an 80-year-old loyalty, seemed utterly transformed. His tense, vigilant posture was gone, replaced by the relaxed, gentle sprawl of a dog who was finally, completely home. Marty watched them from her armchair, a cup of steaming coffee warming her hands. The military supply tin lay open on the table, its contents bathed in the morning light. No longer relics of sorrow, but artifacts of inspiration. The emotional connection to the past had clarified the future for all three of them. Grace, whose professional life in Boston had become a sterile cycle of designing soulless corporate courtyards, had found the purpose she had been desperately seeking. She stood up, her face resolute, and walked to the window, her professional eye immediately sweeping past the dilapidated state of the Miller cottage, the peeling paint, the sagging porch, the overgrown, tangled mess of the yard, to the structure's intrinsic integrity. "The bones are good," Grace declared, her voice regaining the commanding confidence of her profession, but now imbued with passion. "They built these old coastal homes to last. This isn't a teardown, Marty. This is a restoration project." She turned back, her green eyes shining with a vision that had suddenly become crystal clear. Helen and Hank didn't just need a house. They needed a sanctuary, the trust fund. The way Helen fought for this place, it wasn't just for Hank. It was for the idea of home. And Hank was a veteran, a hero. Grace walked over to the table and gently picked up the silver star, the metal warming in her palm. I'm going to restore it, all of it. The cottage, the land, the garden. But it won't be a museum for sadness. It's going to be a living heritage, a place of genuine healing purpose. Her gaze lifted to meet Marty's. I'm going to convert the cottage into a small respite home for veterans and their families, a place where they can escape the noise, feel the peace of the coast, and find their own second chance. The garden is going to be a healing space, a landscape designed not for aesthetics, but for quiet contemplation. I'm going to move here. I need to do this. Marty listened, the quiet peace she had been searching for washing over her, but it was not the emptiness of solitude. It was the satisfaction of a mission completed and a greater purpose achieved. Grace's plan was the perfect final dedication to Helen's unwavering vigil and Hank's ultimate sacrifice. It was an act of profound, active loyalty. That, Marty said, her voice steady and warm, is what Helen was fighting for. She looked at the relics and then at Bruiser Rocky, who had placed his head on Grace's knee, confirming his approval. The weight of her own past, the grief over Robert, the unacknowledged fatigue from decades of service, all of it felt lighter, finally placed in context with Helen and Hank's massive story. Marty had sought isolation, hoping the cold silence of Maine would numb her pain. Instead, she had been led by a magnificent dog to a story of profound connection, discovering that the path to her own healing lay not in retreating but in connecting and serving. She had found her post again. I'll help you, Marty stated, the words simple and absolutely true. I know construction, I know logistics, and I know veterans. You'll need permits, you'll need the community, and you'll need a master sergeant who knows how to organize a work detail. The offer was accepted with a shared, powerful smile, a silent covenant sealed between two women, two veterans, one from the battlefield, one from the emotional front lines of a corporate world, united by the fidelity of a dog. Grace immediately called her Boston firm, delivering a brisk, professional resignation that felt like the sweetest victory. She returned to Portland only to finalize her move, leaving Bruiser Rocky, the official new Sentinel, in Marty's care. The dog no longer sat by the old, ruined mailbox. His new post was the front porch of Marty's cottage, waiting patiently for the Jeep to return, his tail giving a short, happy thump whenever Marty walked by. Over the next few months, the Miller cottage, now affectionately dubbed the Lighthouse Echo by Marty, began its transformation. Marty, with her sharp planning and determined energy, became the on-site foreman. Grace, finally working on a project with soul and meaning, drew up plans that honored the original structure while incorporating accessible therapeutic garden spaces for quiet reflection. The Veterans Quilting Circle adopted the project, offering to make the first new quilts for the respite home, turning the local gossip into supportive, active community engagement. The house, once a silent monument to loss, was resurrected piece by piece. The final image, 6 months later, was one of triumph and quiet joy. The Miller cottage stood tall, freshly shingled and painted a warm, comforting cream, its porch light burning brightly, a perpetual flame that was no longer waiting for a ghost, but welcoming the living. The overgrown yard had been transformed by Grace into a gentle curving landscape of native flowers and walking paths. Bruiser Rocky was sprawling happily on the new porch, his eyes soft, his vigil finally over. Inside, Marty and Grace stood side by side, their hands resting on the newly restored wooden railing. They were an unlikely but perfectly matched pair, the seasoned, retired Marine who had found a purpose outside her grief, and the young architect who had found her purpose outside corporate sterility. They had found home and family in the most unexpected place. The Miller Cottage, rescued by the loyalty of a dog, a silver star, and the determined heart of a former master sergeant, stood proudly on Shore Road. It was no longer a symbol of waiting, but a true new beacon, shining not across the ocean, but straight into the hearts of all who needed to find their way home.